When people told you not to waste your money on the 4GB version of an otherwise average graphics card back in 2015, you laughed in their face. You knew that sometime soon, 4GB GPUs would finally see their day in the sun. Well, Nostradamus, let's see if you were right. Games these days like to let you know how much VRAM they want from you. Whereas in the olden days, frame buffer capacity was almost always less of a limitation than memory bandwidth or compute power, now it seems it's possible for a perfectly capable graphics card to be let down by not having enough VRAM for today's more demanding games. The nVidia GTX 960 was available most commonly in a 2GB variant, and that card is likely not going to hold up well in 2021 and 2022 titles. The version I have here, however, has 4GB of GDDR5. Sadly, this one set me back a little more than I think it's going to be worth. I think the £150 I paid, equivalent to about $200, is way too much, even today. But hey, let's find out. The recently released PC version of God of War has a whole host of visual upgrades over the PS4 original, but you likely won't see those with the GTX 960. 1080 original was the best I could manage, and kept a fairly consistent 30 FPS throughout on both the 6-core overclock setup and the stock quad-core. Enabling FSR quality smooths frame rates out a bit, at the cost of some detail and some visual artifacts, particularly the halo effect around Kratos. The permanently enabled dynamic resolution scaling of Final Fantasy VII Remake does make comparisons kinda pointless. Thanks to DRS, the 960 manages to stick to roughly 60 FPS at quote-unquote 1080 high settings. Lows in the 30s aren't uncommon with the graphics cards I've tested so far, however dips are slightly more common with the quad-core configuration, whose 1% frame rate is in the low 20s. Like the other Maxwell cards I've tested so far, the 511.79 drivers cause intolerably slow gameplay in Guardians of the Galaxy. Rolling back to 471.11 resolves this, and the built-in benchmark will then average 35 FPS at 80% of 1080, with 1% lows of 21. My experience of gameplay so far, at least in early stages of the game, indicates that you'll see those low 20s more often than not, so I'd suggest a lower resolution scale might be in order. Forza Horizon 5's internal benchmark errs on the side of caution. 1080 high scores an average of about 40 FPS, but in gameplay you'll only see frame rates that low in the city area or in some of the busier races. To be on the safe side, dropping settings and introducing FSR helps a great deal. Medium settings with FSR quality pushes frames up over 50, and low with FSR quality hits the magic 60. Halo infinitely prefers Maxwell-based GPUs over GCN2, it seems. Last month I tested the AMD R9 290 and saw almost the same FPS today on the GTX 960, a substantially less powerful card. That means 1080 low settings sees about 30 FPS in open world single player, a little below 40 FPS in big team multiplayer, and over 50 FPS with resolution scaling dropped to the minimum of 71%. Not an optimal experience, but perhaps enough to tide you over until you can upgrade. Cyberpunk 2077 may be the old man of the benchmark suite, but he's still not going to take any shit from a GTX 960. 1080 low is barely playable, averaging just 30 FPS, and with lows in the mid-20s. FSR quality makes things more playable, pushing up to the mid-40s and mid-20s respectively. Your CPU may come into play somewhat once you start using resolution scaling. The quad-core is about 5 to 8% slower, which may or may not be noticeable to you. For whatever reason, quality settings adjustments don't seem to make all that big of a difference to frame rates on these GPUs in Rainbow Six Extraction. 1080 high gives about a 47 FPS average on the built-in benchmark, regardless of whether I'm testing on the quad-core or 6-core. Getting close to the magic 60 necessitates dropping resolution scaling to 75%, which still looks okay to my eye. Like most competitive shooters in the free-to-play esports category, Splitgate's a pretty resource-light game and doesn't pose much of a problem for the GTX 960. It's still possible to obtain 120 FPS at 1080 Epic, though you aren't losing much in the way of a visual experience by dropping settings, so if you have a 144 or 165Hz monitor, this could well be a good choice to showcase it regardless of whether you have a quad-core or 6-core. Call of Duty Vanguard, on the other hand, is really asking to be run at low settings and with some resolution scaling. The game presents one of the better examples of FSR, so dropping to sub-native resolutions is painless, and the results are, well, they're not great, but we all have to make sacrifices here, okay? FSR quality would be my choice, with averages at about 60 FPS give or take. FSR
balanced
looks pretty rough, but in return gains about 20 frames. Chapter 3 is proving a little more demanding than previous Fortnite chapters, but the GTX 960 is still up to the task. Competitive settings at 1920 by 1080 averages 130 FPS, with 1% lows just below 90. The quad-core configuration doesn't suffer much compared to the 6-core, in fact I'd call it a margin of error difference. Turning quality up to high isn't advisable on this GPU, the average drops to 45 and lows into the 20s, making for a less than ideal multiplayer experience. Pretty though. The GTX 970 made for a pretty good 60 FPS experience in Battlefield 2042, and the GTX 960 can match it surprisingly easily. The 970 managed this at 1080 low, the 960 only requires dropping resolution to 900 to get averages a little under 60 and 1% lows of 40. If you have a GTX 960 already, that settles the question. If you're thinking about buying a 960 for this game, however, you might want to hold fire. My testing showed the AMD R9 290 beating the GTX 970 by a big margin, so this might be another game that just doesn't like Maxwell very much. Obtaining a good frame rate in Call of Duty Warzone once more requires some resolution scaling. Until FSR is inevitably added, it's in Vanguard after all, that means the resolution scale slider, which at 1080 bottoms out at 67%, or roughly equivalent to 1280 by 720. Lowest settings sees averages ever so slightly below 60 FPS. Of the games featured today, many of them do not suffer 2GB cards lightly. Some, according to other videos I've seen, won't even start on systems with 2GB cards without some workarounds. Others won't start at all. And titles like Warzone will simply give you such low texture quality you might as well play a 5-year-old game instead. In that respect then, the 4GB variant of the 960 might prove to have been a good purchase after all. Sadly, this doesn't make the 960 a good performer in 2022. It is workable, and can even give surprisingly good results in some cases, but if you have AAA games in mind, this is definitely a placeholder for your next GPU, rather than a hidden gem. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.